Billy the Kid found a settler woman hanging on the roof with Indian's lover written on her. Winter of 1878. Billy rode a narrow cut along the mountainside, hat pulled low, the brim rimed with frost. His coat had seen years of wind, rain, and gun smoke, and the leather reins in his hand were worn soft in places where his fingers had worried them on long rides. He had been keeping to the edges of things these past months. Small towns, back roads, the kind of places where a man's face wasn't worth remembering unless it meant trouble. Some called it hiding. He called it staying alive. The horse's hooves sank into the crusted snow with a slow crunch, each step sending up a faint spray of powder that caught in the sunlight before falling back to the earth. His breath came in white plumes, the kind that lingered just long enough to remind you how cold the day really was. It was the sound that turned him, low, uneven, not belonging to wind or tree. At first it was faint, a rhythm almost mistaken for the groan of a branch under snow, but too steady. He drew the horse to a stop and listened. There it was again, a weighted creak, the kind of sound a rope makes when burdened. He nudged the horse forward, following the noise around a bend. The cabin came into view like a thing left behind by time. Logs darkened with years of weather, the roofline bent slightly under snow, a stone chimney trailing a thread of smoke too thin for the hour. But his eyes went first to the figure. She was hanging from the porch beam, wrists tied above her head, body swaying slightly in the wind. Barefoot, toes mottled blue-white against the roofline's edge, dressed thin as a last scrap of summer, her hair a tangled snarl caught in the gusts. The skin at her wrists was raw where the rope bit in. The wind toyed with her hem and whispered around the corners of the cabin. Above the door, burned deep into the pine with a branding iron, were the words, "Indian's lover." Billy dismounted without hurry. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped to her. Her eyes fluttered open at the shadow falling across her, clouded with cold and pain yet still sharp enough to meet his gaze. No words passed. He reached up, drew his knife from his belt, and cut the rope. She fell into his arms with no more weight than a bundle of damp linen. Her body was stiff from the cold, breath shallow as though each one cost her dearly. He held her for a moment, feeling the shiver of life still running through her, then carried her inside. The air of the cabin was stale, touched with the lingering bitterness of a fire gone to ash. One chair lay tipped on its side. The small table stood bare except for a tin cup overturned near the edge. He set her gently on the cot, if it could be called that, and pulled the single blanket over her. She curled into it instinctively, like a leaf folding on itself in frost. Billy crouched by the hearth, brushing ash aside with the back of his hand. There were still embers buried deep, faint as fireflies in the dark. He split kindling from the woodpile beside the wall, the hatchet's bite sounding too loud in the stillness, and laid the pieces with a patience learned from years of coaxing life back into reluctant flames. Soon the crackle began, tentative, then stronger, throwing small bursts of light across the dim room. She watched from within the hollow of the blanket, eyes darting now and then toward the door. The word burned there might as well have been branded into her skin. He saw it in the way she flinched each time the wind shifted and the door creaked. He didn't ask. Questions were easy weapons, and he'd learned not to use them unless he meant to hurt. From the kettle hanging on its hook, he poured water into a chipped mug and set it on the small table within her reach. He stepped back, giving her the space to take or leave it. Her fingers emerged from the blanket, gripping the mug with both hands, the knuckles pale under skin chapped and split. She sipped slowly, steam curling up to touch her cheek. No words, only the hiss of sap in the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind against the walls. Night fell quick in the high country, the blue light dying into black without ceremony. Wind rattled the shutters and whispered through the chinks between logs. Billy sat on the floor, boots off, mending the split seam of one with an awl and thick thread. The scrape and pull of the tool was steady, measured, a sound that had calmed him on nights when the world outside was less forgiving. At some point, without turning toward him, she began to speak. The words came in pieces, as though she were finding them in the dark and handing them over one by one. She had loved a man once, an Apache. She didn't say his name, but her voice changed when she spoke of him, softening like sunlight through thin smoke. He had been killed, shot down in the red dust outside a canyon. Her father, settler, rancher, a man whose name held weight in this territory, had years earlier ordered a raid on Apache families, a massacre people whispered of without ever telling it whole. The town had not forgiven her for loving the son of those they'd slaughtered. Traitor, they called her. This, she said, was their justice. Billy's hands didn't pause in their work. He had known cruelty wearing the mask of law, the smile of scripture, the handshake of business. He had been those things himself, in his own ways. After a long moment, he said only, "I've done my share of wrong. Didn't like theirs." By morning, the wind had stripped the sky bare, the sun sharp enough to make the snow's crust glitter. The sound of hoofbeats came up the frozen trail, 3 men riding hard. Billy stepped onto the porch, leaning against the post as they drew up. One swung down with a folded paper, her name scrawled across it like a verdict. The others stayed mounted, eyes sharp, hands easy near their gun belts. "She's wanted," the man with the paper said. "Come quiet and no one gets hurt." His voice carried just enough for the cabin wall to pass it through. Billy's expression didn't shift. "Cabin's full." The man took a step closer. "Ain't asking." Billy pushed off the post, the boards underfoot creaking. The space between them closed to the width of a breath. No gun drawn, no raise in tone. Just the quiet of a man who'd stood his ground before and never cared much for the odds. The bounty man's eyes flickered. Somewhere behind, a horse stamped, its bridle jingling in the cold. The tension hung long enough for the wind to whistle between them. Then the men broke first, muttering their threats as they turned their horses back down the trail. Inside, she was standing by the window, shoulders trembling, not from fear, from the shock of someone standing between her and harm without naming a price. Days blurred into each other after that, winter tightening its grip. The world beyond the cabin became nothing but white and shadow. He rose before dawn, leaving coffee on the stove for her. She began mending his shirts without speaking of it. Sometimes, when he returned from cutting wood, there would be an extra log by the hearth, placed there in quiet thanks. They spoke little, but each gesture began to stitch something wordless between them. One night, as snow hissed against the shutters, she asked why he hadn't turned her in. He shrugged. Didn't like theirs. She studied his face in the firelight, as if weighing the truth of it, and let the silence stand. But debts have a way of finding you. A week later they came again. This time at night, their lanterns swaying through the trees like the eyes of hungry animals. Billy woke to the muffled crunch of boots in snow, the smell of smoke riding ahead of them. The barn went first, fire leaping high, painting the cabin walls in frantic orange. Smoke rolled low, bitter and choking. "Go to the tree line," he told her. She shook her head. "Not anymore." They stepped out together into the heat and the cold. He moved ahead, the barn's light casting his shadow long across the snow. She followed, the kitchen knife he'd sharpened clutched tight in her hand. The fight was brief and clumsy. Men shoving through smoke, lantern light swinging wild. One fled into the night, another went down hard with a groan. The last stumbled back from the heat and was lost in the dark. The barn collapsed in a roar, sparks rising to vanish among the stars. When dawn came, it found them standing in the churned snow, ash drifting like black snowflakes. The barn was nothing but ribs of timber against the washed-out sky. She looked at it for a long time before saying, "There's no going back." He nodded. Wasn't planning to. Inside, he set a length of pine across the table and began smoothing it with a drawknife. She watched from the doorway, the light catching her hair. "What's that for?" she asked. "Chair," he said. It wasn't about seating. It was about belonging. They spent the day clearing the wreckage, side by side. That night the wind was softer, carrying only the smell of pine. Weeks later, the cabin hummed with the small sounds of a lived-in place. Kettle whistling, chairs scraping, 2 voices in quiet conversation. Others began to find their way there. A boy with one arm, a widow with 2 daughters, people who didn't belong anywhere else. The table grew crowded. The chair he'd made for her was always hers. One evening, as the light bled gold through the slats, she stood in the doorway watching him plane another piece of wood. The scars on her wrists had faded to pale bands. "You think they'll come again?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the wood. "If they do," he said, "they'll find us here." Outside, the wind curled around the eaves like it was testing the seams. Down the trail, faint and far, came the sound of hoofbeats.